911, what's your emergency?
She's not moving! Oh God, he's stomping her! He won't stop!
Ma'am, who's attacking her?
It's her horse! Her own horse is killing her!
Sophie Allen believed her horse would never hurt her. But on a quiet Sunday ride, her faith was shattered by the hooves she trusted most. If this tragedy left you speechless, don't forget to subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments, could this have been prevented? Sophie Allen was the kind of woman whose life seemed to orbit entirely around one magnificent creature, a towering black Friesian gelding named Dakota. At just 28 years old, Sophie had already built a name for herself in the tight-knit equestrian community of Ocala, Florida, a place often referred to as the horse capital of the world. Her students adored her for her gentle but firm teaching style, and her Instagram account, filled with filtered shots of windswept rides and tender muzzle kisses, painted a portrait of pure harmony between woman and beast. She had been riding since she could walk, but it was Dakota acquired as a spirited colt at the age of 3 who transformed her from a hobbyist into what many saw as a horse whisperer. Over the years, Sophie chronicled their bond with the dedication of a documentarian, synchronized cantering through shallow surf at sunrise, meditative trail rides through pine forests, Dakota nuzzling her shoulder as she recited poems about trust and loyalty. "He's not a beast, he's a mirror," she once wrote beneath a photo of Dakota's deep, intelligent eyes. To Sophie, this horse wasn't just an animal, he was her confidant, her co-therapist, her better half. But to those who knew horses not just loved them, but studied them, there was something unsettling lurking beneath the surface. Friends began to notice small but undeniable shifts. Dakota hesitating to follow commands, tossing his head at sudden noises, refusing jumps he once cleared with elegance. Sophie laughed it off during casual barn conversations, insisting Dakota was just having an off week or picking up on her stress. Behind the scenes, whispers began to circulate among more seasoned riders. Was Dakota reacting to pain, or had he simply become too dominant, too unpredictable for trail work? One fellow trainer, who asked to remain anonymous, recalled a tense moment during a lesson when Dakota suddenly backed up aggressively, nearly pinning Sophie against the arena fence. "She just stroked his neck and told him it was okay," the trainer said. She looked more worried about hurting his feelings than about getting hurt herself. Therein lay the fatal irony. Sophie's love wasn't performative. It was deep, consuming, and tragically blinding. The more Dakota resisted, the more Sophie leaned in, not with boundaries, but with affection. She believed that her unwavering trust could rewrite instinct, that gentleness could overcome raw, untamed animal reflex. What she didn't see, what she refused to see, was that Dakota was changing. Not out of malice, but maturity. He was growing stronger, more dominant, and increasingly disassociated from the obedient colt he once was. But Sophie never pulled back. She only leaned closer. That fatal closeness, that unwavering faith in a creature governed not by reason but by instinct, would become the very thing that cost her her life. The world she curated, online a montage of perfect light, perfect rides, perfect trust, was already beginning to crack. And still, she smiled in every frame, her hand resting on the forehead of the horse she called her soulmate. The signs weren't subtle. Dakota, once the picture of grace and responsiveness, began to resist in ways that were impossible to ignore. He refused jumps he'd cleared 100 times before, balked at open gates, and startled at shadows like a green colt instead of a seasoned gelding. Most concerning to those around him was a new, unsettling behavior began pinning his ears when Sophie entered his stall, a classic signal of equine agitation and dominance. To the trained eye, it wasn't a mystery. Something in Dakota had shifted, either physically or psychologically. A visiting vet, called in after a particularly violent bucking episode, warned Sophie of potential underlying causes: equine protozoal myeloencephalitis, EPM, ulcers, or other pain-induced behavioral disorders. He suggested blood work and imaging, but Sophie waved him off. "He just gets anxious," she told him, pulling a pouch of lavender oil from her grooming bag. Instead of diagnostics, she doubled down on natural remedies: magnesium powder, valerian root, daily massages. She believed in Dakota's emotions the way others believed in data. Fellow riders started to worry. One of her students witnessed Sophie being thrown hard during a warm-up and landing on her shoulder. She limped for days but laughed it off, saying, "We're just having a bad season. He's moody like me." Another time, a groom found Dakota biting at his stall bars and stomping at imagined threats, his eyes glassy and wild. Sophie blamed the weather. The anthropomorphism was constant. To her, Dakota wasn't exhibiting equine distress, was processing trauma, needing space, or mirroring her internal state. But horses aren't people, and Dakota wasn't a misunderstood partner. He was a prey animal, powerful, instinct-driven, and unpredictable when pushed past his comfort zone. Equine behaviorist Dr. Evelyn Rowe later commented, "Horses mask pain until they can't. When that line breaks, it can be catastrophic." At Silver Pines Equestrian, where Sophie boarded Dakota, the barn manager, an older woman named Linda Garrison, tried to intervene. After Dakota reared unexpectedly while being tacked and nearly kicked a stable hand, Linda pulled Sophie aside. "You need to stop riding him on the trails," she said, "at least until we figure out what's going on. He's not safe right now." But Sophie, smiling through the concern, replied, "We're working through it. He needs consistency." Linda, a seasoned horsewoman who had seen more than her share of tragic overconfidence, shook her head. "Consistency doesn't fix pain," she warned. But her words fell on ears full of conviction. Sophie believed her bond with Dakota transcended the usual rules. That love, understanding, and patience would fix what muscle, bone, and brain could no longer hide. Every warning became another test of her faith. Every red flag a misunderstood plea for compassion. She wasn't riding a horse anymore. She was riding a belief, and that belief was about to buckle. It was a Sunday morning like any other in Ocala, sunlight pouring through the mossy oaks, the air crisp with early autumn, and the familiar rhythm of hooves echoing through the boarding facility at Silver Pines. Sophie Allen arrived just after 7, coffee in hand, dressed in worn breeches, a faded t-shirt, and riding boots scuffed from years of devotion. She was smiling, chatting with another boarder about plans for brunch later that day. "He seems calm today," she said brightly, running her hand along Dakota's flank. She tacked him herself, methodical and affectionate, humming softly as she tightened the girth. No helmet, she rarely wore one on trail rides. To Sophie, Dakota wasn't a risk, he was a refuge. The trail they took was familiar, a wide pine needle path circling the edge of a wildlife preserve just beyond the stables. Witnesses saw her mount gracefully, coaxing Dakota into a smooth trot as they passed the outdoor ring. "She looked so happy," one rider recalled, like she was exactly where she belonged. But the serenity was a facade. At the far end of the trail, just out of sight of the barn, a motion-triggered wildlife camera captured a very different image. Dakota fidgeting beneath the saddle, his tail swishing aggressively, ears swiveling back and forth. He circled sharply, snorted, and tossed his head, whites of his eyes showing. Something had shifted. Whether it was a distant rustle of deer in the underbrush or the sudden buzz of a low-flying drone nearby, no one could say for sure. But the trigger didn't need to be dramatic, just enough to pierce the thin membrane between calm and chaos. Dakota stopped, ears locked forward, his body coiled, and then he reared. Not a playful hop or a test of dominance. A full, vertical launch into the air, front hooves striking out blindly. Sophie, caught off guard, lost the reins. Her balance broke in a single blink. She tumbled backward, slamming into the packed earth with a force that knocked the wind from her lungs. For a split second, there was silence. Then everything unraveled. Dakota, now untethered from both reins and reason, began to panic, lunging, bucking, hooves striking out at invisible threats, or perhaps just responding to primal terror. The calm, measured gelding Sophie believed she knew was gone. What remained was a 300-pound storm of muscle, fear, and instinct. And Sophie, lying dazed in his path, was no longer his rider. She was a target, The moment had turned. There would be no recovery, no second chance to regain control. What began as a quiet ride before breakfast was now barreling toward a tragedy too brutal to imagine, and it had all unfolded in less than 60 seconds. The ground met Sophie Allen with sickening force, her spine absorbing the shock of the fall before her head struck the packed earth with a dull, lifeless thud. Dazed or already unconscious, it didn't matter. What came next shattered any illusion of safety that her years of trust had built. Instead of fleeing, as horses typically do when startled, Dakota spun around with his front hooves raised, then lunged forward with terrifying intent. He came down hard, his iron-shod hooves slamming into Sophie's chest once, twice, then again. Witnesses later said they heard the crack of bones snapping from over 200 feet away. The sound was described as unnatural, sharp, like thick branches breaking under weight. A woman walking her retriever nearby dropped her leash and screamed. She froze for a second, unsure if what she was seeing was real, then pulled out her phone and called 911 with trembling hands. As her voice trembled into the receiver, Dakota continued his frenzied assault. He didn't trample and retreat, circled, snorted, and struck again, this time crushing Sophie's shoulder and neck under his full weight. Her body jerked once and then went still. Blood pooled beneath her hair. She was no longer moving, but Dakota didn't stop. He stomped once more, his hooves landing across her ribs with such force that her entire torso visibly collapsed. The pathologist's report would later describe the injuries in clinical horror: compound skull fractures with brain extrusion, thoracic collapse from multiple rib fractures, pulverized sternum, and blunt force trauma, in excess of a vehicular impact at highway speed. Her internal organs were ruptured, her face nearly unrecognizable. When the police arrived 6 minutes later, they found Dakota frothing at the mouth, eyes rolling, circling around the mangled body like a predator confused by its kill. Sophie lay motionless, her once white t-shirt stained a deep crimson, her body twisted in a way that suggested nothing had been spared. Officers kept their distance, too afraid to approach the panicked horse until animal control arrived. A tranquilizer dart finally brought him to his knees, but not before several failed attempts. The horror of the scene was not just in its brutality, but in its betrayal. Sophie had spent her life believing that love, pure, patient, all-consuming, could overwrite instinct. But instinct doesn't read devotion. It doesn't recognize years of care or whispered promises. It reacts. And in that moment, Dakota was not her partner, her mirror, her soulmate in hooves. He was a terrified, cornered animal. And Sophie was simply in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Viewers may try to rationalize what happened, search for the trigger, the flaw, the warning missed. But what this scene forces us to confront is darker and more primal. Love is no armor against nature. And in Sophie's final moments, all the trust she had built collapsed under the weight of a single, uncontrollable truth. The stillness that followed the chaos was almost unbearable. As Dakota lay sedated on the ground, his sides heaving and nostrils flaring, the entire Silver Pines facility went into immediate lockdown. Staff were ordered to remain indoors. The barn aisle, usually alive with the sounds of hoofbeats and laughter, fell silent. Dakota was carefully loaded into a trailer and transported to a veterinary center for emergency behavioral evaluation. Sophie's lifeless body had already been taken by paramedics, but the stains on the trailhead told a story no one wanted to believe. By midday, word had spread. Within hours, Sophie's closest friends began arriving at the stables, many in tears, some in utter shock. They brought tea lights and framed photos. One woman tied a satin ribbon to Dakota's empty stall door. Another hung a handwritten note that simply read, "Forever galloping." But grief was not the only thing that arrived. As social media flooded with tributes videos of Sophie riding bareback, smiling into Dakota's mane, whispering secrets only they understood, another wave crashed in. Outrage. Why wasn't she wearing a helmet? Asked one comment under a memorial post. Why didn't she listen to the warnings? Echoed another, more biting. The grief-stricken beauty of her story had begun to fracture, beneath the weight of its preventability. Local news stations picked up the story before sunset, plastering her name and smiling face beneath headlines that felt like cruel punchlines. Beloved rider trampled by her own horse. The footage showed flower bouquets lined up beside the stable gate and drone shots of the trail that had, just hours earlier, become a site of unspeakable violence. Animal control officers launched an investigation that evening. Toxicology screens came back negative. Dakota had not ingested any poisons, hallucinogens, or foreign substances. Blood work showed no rabies, no infection, no systemic illness. The behavioral evaluation noted heightened fear response, but no immediate signs of neurological disease. In plain terms, Dakota wasn't sick, he wasn't provoked. Something had simply snapped. The barn released an official statement the next morning, expressing deep sorrow and announcing an immediate suspension of all trail riding activity until further notice. Riding instructors were instructed to review their safety protocols, and students were told that private sessions would be paused indefinitely. The stable, once proud of its laid-back, helmet-optional culture, was now faced with uncomfortable questions about liability, responsibility, and the myth of total control. Sophie's family declined all interview requests. No press conferences, no camera appearances, just a single, typed statement sent to local outlets. Sophie died doing what she loved. But it should never have happened. The words, stark and simple, carried a haunting duality: pride and pain, love and loss, honor and regret. At Silver Pines, the sun continued to rise over empty stalls and quiet arenas, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, haunted by hoofbeats that once danced through the trees, now echoing as a caution no one could unhear. In the days following Sophie Allen's death, as the public wrestled with disbelief and grief, experts began to weigh in, trying to make sense of what had happened in clinical, biological terms. Among them was Dr. Jenna Mori, a respected equine behaviorist with over 20 years of experience studying the intersection of trauma, physiology, and instinct in horses. In a widely viewed interview, she explained what she called the startle plus, pain plus, herd separation syndromia, perfect storm of conditions that can cause even the most trusted horse to become unpredictably dangerous. According to Dr. Mori, Dakota's erratic behavior in the months leading up to the incident, bucking, pinning ears, resisting commands, was not just moodiness or sensitivity, as Sophie had believed. It was pain. Horses internalize, she said. They're prey animals, hardwired to mask pain until the moment it overwhelms them. Dakota may have been suffering from gastric ulcers, a sacroiliac joint injury, or even subtle nerve damage from old trauma. Any of these could have made saddling, mounting, or trail riding an increasingly intolerable experience. Add in the isolation of being away from his herd, and a sudden startle like a deer in the brush or a drone's buzz, and you have an instinctive explosion, not aggression, not malice, just biology in motion. But the tragedy didn't begin on that trail. It began months before, with a well-intentioned but dangerous misconception that love is protection. Sophie's devotion to Dakota was unquestionable, but her belief that emotional intimacy could replace professional caution was her undoing. Anthropomorphism is the silent killer in human-animal relationships. Dr. Mori explained, "We want them to be people, but they're not. They're animals, with thresholds. And when those thresholds are crossed, instinct takes over fast, without warning." National statistics paint a chilling backdrop. According to the CDC, at least 16 horse-related fatalities occurred in the U.S. last year, and a growing number were not caused by falls, but by trampling. Horses, especially large breeds like Dakota, are capable of delivering forces upward of 1.0 pounds per hoof strike. Forensic analyses from similar cases show that a single misstep, a single moment of fear or pain, can turn a calm animal into a lethal force. Yet too often, this reality is masked by the myth of the special bond, a narrative that romanticizes trust and ignores the primal truth beneath it. Professionals who work with animals every day, veterinarians, trainers, behaviorists, do not skip helmets or override warning signs with affection. They respect the line between affection and control. Sophie didn't, not because she was reckless, but because she believed so deeply in the power of love that she stopped seeing the danger. And in the end, that belief cost her everything. It wasn't a betrayal, Dr. Mori concluded. It was biology. Tragic, brutal biology. And for those watching from the outside, trying to reconcile beauty with horror, that truth may be the hardest one to accept. In the months that followed Sophie Allen's death, the shock slowly gave way to reflection and to action. Dakota, after much debate and public scrutiny, was not euthanized. Instead, he was rehomed to a specialized equine sanctuary in northern Georgia, where he would live out his days under strict supervision, never to be ridden again. Evaluators deemed him mentally unsuitable for riding, not out of aggression, but due to extreme reactivity and unresolved fear responses. For many in the equestrian world, the outcome was a merciful compromission that spared the animal, but carried a permanent reminder of what had been lost. Back in Ocala, the trail where Sophie took her last ride was quietly renamed Sophie's Crossing. A polished wooden plaque now marks the bend where the tragedy unfolded, inscribed with her name and a line that still haunts those who knew her. She saw beauty where others saw danger. The memorial has become a place of pilgrimage. Riders leave flowers, ribbons, even handwritten notes tucked into the nearby fence rails. But the legacy of Sophie's story reached far beyond that quiet grove. Riding schools across the country began revising their safety protocols, some for the first time in decades. Helmet requirements became mandatory, not optional. Trail riding programs introduced behavioral risk assessments for all horses, and new riders were required to take mandatory equine psychology briefings. More importantly, instructors began telling Sophie's story not to scare, but to prepare. She wasn't a beginner, said one trainer during a safety orientation. She was one of us. That's why this matters. A social media movement emerged from the ashes of grief, driven by younger riders who saw in Sophie both an idol and a warning. The hashtag Ride with Respect trended across equestrian forums and platforms like TikTok and Instagram, where riders shared stories of near misses, reevaluated habits, and the hard conversations they'd finally had about instinct versus affection. For once, the algorithm elevated humility over heroism. Riders began showing helmets instead of hair flips, fear instead of false confidence. What had once been a tragedy isolated to a single trail became a rallying cry for a culture to change. And through all of it, Sophie's image remained smiling beside Dakota, eyes closed, one hand resting gently on his bridle as if whispering something only he could hear. In the final analysis, her story wasn't one of recklessness or cruelty. It was one of love, fierce, unfiltered, and ultimately too blind to see the line it crossed. As the narrator's voice fades, one final reflection lingers. In trying to be closer than nature allowed, Sophie crossed an invisible line. Her story is not one of cruelty, but of a love too blind to see the truth. And it leaves us asking the question we too often avoid. How close is too close when it comes to powerful animals? Where does trust end and instinct begin? And are we ever truly in control or merely borrowing peace from creatures we don't fully understand?